Did you know that when you prune your tomato plants, you actually have a chance of making brand new baby tomatoes from those cuttings? Today I want to talk to you about sort of the theory of pruning tomatoes, what you might do differently if you have indeterminate versus determinate tomatoes, and I'm going to go over briefly what those mean if this is the first time hearing that. And I'm going to talk to you about how to take your cuttings and make new little plants for if one of your plants dies, or maybe you just didn't get enough seeds started and you need to propagate out to continue filling up your space. Anything like that. These are also great little gift plants for people. So this method is super easy. Pruning is super easy once you understand what to do, and I'm going to go over all of it in detail for you in this video. Alright, so let's start off with the difference between a determinate and an indeterminate tomato. If you don't know what kind you have, just Google variety name determinate or indeterminate and it should pop right up for almost all varieties of tomato. And if you're the sort of person who bought your plants at the store, then it will definitely be on Google. But a determinate tomato is a plant that it grows up to a certain size and then it puts on all of its fruit at once. Whereas an indeterminate tomato will grow and put on some fruit here and grow and put on some fruit here. And it will keep doing that and getting bigger and bigger and bigger until something kills it. And so because these two types of tomatoes have very different growth habits, we need to prune them pretty differently. Your pruning style also can have to do with the sort of space that you have available to grow your tomatoes in. For example, if you have a lot of space and you can space your tomatoes pretty far apart, you might not even need to prune them at all. And if you are in a very tight space, a lot of times people will maximize a tight space by pruning really aggressively to keep tomatoes from competing too hard with each other. So I'm going to show you today what I do, and I think I'm sort of kind of in the middle of aggressive pruning and not pruning, maybe slightly more toward the aggressive side. So as you're watching this video and probably other videos on your search for how to prune tomatoes, take that into account. This is my row of tomatoes. I am growing indeterminate tomatoes vertically. So I am training them up this trellis in a single stem fashion. Now, sometimes with something like this, you could go for 2 or 3 main stems and make it work, but I've kind of spaced my plants pretty close together, and so I am going for a single stem with each of these. And I will show you what I mean by single stem. So let's start with this tomato plant right here. You can see the stem here, and you can kind of trace it all the way up through here, up to the top of the plant right here. And this has already been pruned a little bit to be growing in a single stem habit. Now, if you look near the top, you can see right here, right here, right here, these are what we call suckers, and each one of these can grow into a brand new main stem, just as big, just as productive as this main stem that we already have. And the way you can tell if it is a sucker, so you see right here we have this big leafy branch. It is coming out at about a 90-degree angle, a right angle from the main stem, and then splitting it right down the middle at about 45 degrees is this smaller sucker. And you can kind of tell it's a sucker because as they get bigger, they will kind of floof out and make more than one little branch. A leaf branch is almost always going to be just a single branch of leaves. Of course, you'll see some variation, and sometimes plants get confused and start making suckers like halfway down a leaf stem, but for the most part, you will see it look just like this, with a single leaf stem and something coming out at a 45-degree angle that looks like the top of a tomato plant. Oh, it is hot out there in the sun, so I'm going to take you back in the shade for a second while I explain why we would want to remove those suckers that, like I just said, they can grow into a whole nother plant just full of fruit, lots of production. Every single sucker could theoretically grow as much as just a single stem if you're pruning. So why do we want to get rid of that? Well, tomatoes, especially indeterminate varieties, are sort of a ground vining plant. They grow up a bit and then the branches sort of fall over onto the soil, and anywhere where they touch the soil, they will put out new roots and they will kind of vine along the ground like that. And you can let tomatoes grow like this. This is what they naturally do. But most of us have probably thought of and seen tomatoes grown vertically. We pull them up off the ground because we want to be able to harvest that fruit. A lot of times when a tomato is let to grow naturally, the fruit will touch the ground and it will rot or something will eat it, and we're just not able to get to it fast enough. So the first reason why you might want to prune your tomato is so that you are able to pull it up off the ground. If you don't prune it and you're keeping it off the ground, then you're going to have a hard time kind of controlling it to the trellis. The second reason that you might want to prune your tomato and take those suckers off and even some of the lower leaves, which I'm going to show you, is to prevent disease. Now, tomatoes are pretty susceptible to humidity-based diseases. Very specifically, you'll see in most places, most people who grow tomatoes, they will remove the bottom leaves of their tomato to keep the leaves high up off the soil so that pathogens from the soil don't splash up onto the leaves every time it rains. So you can prevent this by pruning off those lower leaves as you go up. The tomato plant doesn't really need most of them. Or you could grow your tomatoes in a covered, protected area and water at ground level via irrigation. So, something else you can do, getting back around to the reason that pruning helps, especially if you're growing outside, is that you want airflow to kind of help mitigate anything that does end up splashing up onto your tomatoes. And if you let your tomatoes kind of jungle and grow all together, they will get very dense foliage and there won't be a lot of airflow, and you'll find that your leaves look really unhealthy in this scenario. So pruning all those lower leaves off, making sure you keep 1 or 2 single stems as you go up, keeps some space around your tomatoes for that airflow, helps you stay in control of where the plant is going, because trust me, they get out of control really fast. And it keeps your fruit up off the ground so that you can harvest it before the bugs get to it. So back to our same tomato plant here. What I would do to prune this guy is I would remove the suckers. And these ones are small enough I can just pull them out with my fingers, but if they're any bigger, then you might want to use some clippers. So I'm going to pull all of these suckers all the way up to the top. And if you feel unsure of whether or not you can tell the difference between a sucker near the top and the top of the plant, you can just wait a couple of days and it should become pretty obvious which is which. But also, as long as you only take one of them, it doesn't matter, because remember, a sucker can grow all the way up into a new plant. So if I had taken this one instead and left this one, that would have been fine. This is technically the top of the plant. It is a little higher up and you can see it's more in line with the main stem, but leaving this one and taking this one would have been just as good. And then the next thing I'm going to do is, you can see some of that leaf damage I'm talking about already happening on these leaves near the soil. So I am going to break off these lower leaves. Again, these are kind of small, so I can just use my hands, but anything bigger, you really should use clippers. And just pull off everything as we're going up. Now, you can't prune too high above the soil when your plants are small, because they do need that foliage. But once a plant is this size, I could probably take all the way up to the trellis leaves off of this, and this plant would be just fine. It is growing really quickly and it has all these big branches to go. So that is kind of the basics of pruning tomatoes. So for a determinate tomato, you probably wouldn't want to prune quite as aggressively, because like I said, they do grow up to a set size and then set all their fruit at once. So what you can do with your determinate plants is maybe prune down to 3 or 4 main stems, keep the foliage near the bottom cleared out, and then just kind of allow it to bush out near the top, because the production that you get during that first flush is pretty much the production for the whole plant's life. And a little note here about keeping your determinate tomato upright. Tomato cages, I feel like they're not really good for tomatoes in most senses. A tomato cage, they're kind of skinny for how big a tomato plant can get, even a determinate one. And so because of that, people stuff their tomatoes on the inside to kind of help support them, and they end up like not letting airflow in because they've got all the leaves all crunched up in the middle of that tomato cage. Even if you're growing determinate varieties, I recommend getting either the largest size tomato cage that you can, or using posts or trellises to keep your tomatoes up off the ground. I use tomato cages for my peppers. I think they're great, but I just don't think that they're really well suited for tomatoes. Okay, so lastly, I want to show you how to take those tomato cuttings and make them into whole new tomato plants. So I'm going through here looking for a plant that has a sucker that has gotten a little out of control. It's a little bigger, and this one is a really good example. You can see right here, this is the sucker coming out at that 45-degree angle between this leaf and this stem, and the stem is along the ground because I haven't pulled it up yet. But you can see this sucker, it kind of already looks like its own little tomato plant. It's putting on leaves, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and clip it, pull that out so you can see it better. So this is a perfect sucker to use to root into a brand new tomato plant. In order to get a new plant out of this, you have a couple of options. The first one is you can put it in water, like I've done with this one. And I will pull this back out again to show you. This one was a little smaller when I clipped it, but if you leave it in water and sunlight on a windowsill, it will grow roots. And from here you can just literally stick it in the ground and let it grow. Your other option is, if you're feeling lucky, to stick this directly into the dirt. I would put it kind of high up in the dirt and just see if it grows. It should be able to put on roots if you keep the dirt moist enough for like 4 or 5 days. It shouldn't even need the in-between jar step. Whichever method you choose though, after a while, your new cutting will start to droop like this, and that is normal. You didn't do anything wrong, just give it some time and it will bounce back. And like I was saying before, reasons that you might want to do this include one of your plants dying suddenly. For me, I have cats that sometimes just like to lay on my plants, especially when they're young. So if I have one that gets snapped off because a cat landed on it, or maybe I stepped on it, then I have a way to replace that plant pretty quickly, because taking a cutting and rooting it is so much faster than regrowing that same plant from seed. And it's a little more economical than having a ton of extra plants that you just start from seed because of the space that takes. These also are great ways to give away plants to your friends, and I definitely am somebody who loves to provide my friends with plants. And I'm taking all these cuttings anyway, you know, it is quite an excess. It feels like a really good use for that. Kata is down here sitting underneath my tripod. She is the reason that you see it occasionally shake, because she likes to rub her head up against it. Alrighty guys, and that is it for this short tutorial. I hope that this was helpful for you, and if you still have questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to help you out. If you want to check out other videos that I have about tomatoes, how to harvest tomatoes in particular, you can check that out right here. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy gardening!